Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Today is the third video on this short series on creating your own Google Calendar event page using the Google Calendar API and a Netlify serverless function. Now, this is the end result, and as you can see here, people can query and then see even details, view the event themselves, and they can decide how many events they want to show, and all these colors are randomly generated. Now, we've set up all the UI so far for this, but now we need to actually start working on the backend, the serverless function, and that's what we're going to work on today. So here's the code we've got over here on the left, and then I've got several tabs open kind of ready for us today. We're going to go through a series of things. First of all, we're going to initialize a local Git repository, get that up to GitHub. Then we're going to connect Netlify and our GitHub account, so that way they can talk to each other and we can build the site whenever we publish to GitHub. Next, we're going to grab an API key from Google, and then finally, we're going to build out that serverless function using that API key and the environmental variables that we can store on Netlify. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. The very first thing I'm going to do is initialize a local repository. I'm just going to use the GUI editor here and initialize a repository. And then let's say something like init commit, and we'll get that up and running. And then the next thing we need to do is actually publish it somewhere. And I can do this either through the GUI, or I think what I'm going to do is just create a new one right here on my GitHub, and then I'll show you how to link those two up. So we're going to call this a Google Calendar event page. For right now, I'm going to make this private, and we'll make this public, obviously, by the time this video goes live. All right, I'll click Create Repository, and that should create it for me. And here, because I've already got an existing repository, I can just add it like this. And they actually give me this from the command line. So let me open up a local terminal here, and let's go ahead and add all of that. And when I hit return, everything should be set to go. Now, to make sure everything worked properly, I can come back over here and refresh, and there is all my stuff with my commit ready to go. Okay, so we've got that. Next, we need to actually go to Netlify at app.netlify.com and add a new site. Now, you're going to import from an existing project, and you just need to have a free Netlify account. And if it's been a while, or if it's your first time, you're going to have to sign in again with GitHub or for the first time, and then you can search your different repos. In this case, I'm going to look for Google. And there it is, so let's go ahead and open it up. Now it's going to actually scan our package.json and figure out what the build command is, and we can just deploy it and we're ready to go. All right, now that finished up pretty quickly, and let's go ahead and change the domain. So I'm going to click Domain Settings here. Let's give ourselves a little bit more space, because unruffled Newton and whatever that is, I'm not sure that's going to help us out. So let's call this Google Cal Event Page, like that, and click Save. Looks like that's available, so that should work. And if I click here, this should open up what we've got so far. And that is what we did last time. So now it's live on the web. And I don't know if I'll leave this up or just leave the link to my actual site up where it's hosted. But either way, now we've got it up and ready to go. All right, so we've got that. The next thing we need to do is actually look at our Google Calendar. You need to have a calendar with actual events on it to be able to test this. And then we're going to need to grab a few things from the actual calendar itself here in a second. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and get an API key from Google. What you need to do is go to console.developers.google.com, and I'll have a link in the description to this as well. If you've already got a project like I do up here, it may show. So what you want to do is come up here, and we're just going to create a brand new project. Now we can call this whatever we want. We're going to call it Calendar Sample, and then I'm just going to create it right here. Now, this might be confusing. Even though you just created it, it's actually not what you're viewing right now. You have to come back up here and then click Calendar Sample, which is a little odd and threw me off the first time. All right, next, let's go ahead and click the sidebar here, and we're going to look at API services, and we want to enable API services. And then I'm going to click up top here and just search for Calendar. When I do that, you're going to see the Google Calendar API, and I want to enable this, and that will get it ready to go so I can connect it to this project. And now I just need to create credentials, which I can do either from here or from this button up here, either way. So I'm going to click that and then go ahead and add some credentials. So I'll click Create Credentials again, and click API key. And it's going to generate this. We need this, and so I'm going to go ahead and copy this. But let me also show you a couple other things you can do under Restrict Key. I will change this by the time you see this, so don't go try and use that key. It's not going to help you out too much. We're going to come in here, and now that I've enabled that, I should be able to find the Google Calendar API, which limits how this key can be used. Eventually, you'd also probably want to limit it by your site so that it can only be accessed from your site rather than any site on the internet or whatever. But for right now, I'm just going to save it, and we're going to leave it being able to access that one restriction, that one API. Now the API key is important because I can actually add it in Netlify and be able to access that when I'm developing and building my site. By adding it in Netlify, I'm never pushing it up to GitHub or anything like that, so it's slightly more secure, and it's going to store it here under the build and deploy environmental variables. So I'm going to open this and click Edit Variables, and let's call this something like cal API. And then I'm just going to paste that value right in there and click Save, and now we're good there. Now I mentioned there's one other thing we actually need to grab from our calendar. If I click here and then select Settings and Sharing, I should be able to scroll down, and what I need is my Google Calendar ID, which is this right here. And then what I can do is come back over to Netlify. We're going to add one more variable here. We'll call this cal ID, and then I'll paste it in here. This isn't so much secure as it is that I'm always going to want to keep those things linked, and so I'm just going to leave it like that in there. So what we've done so far is we've initialized a Git repository, sent it up to GitHub, grabbed our API key and our calendar ID, and then added both of those things to our Netlify build so that we can interact with it as we're developing. So the next thing we need to do is actually to build out our Netlify function, and that's the final thing we need to do. And what we're going to do is I'm going to, again, leave links to all this in the description, but I'm going to go ahead and install this globally first on my machine. And note that you do need Node version 12.2 or higher. If you don't know if you have that, you can type node -- version, I think it is, and it will tell you what version of Node you have. And if you need a higher version, just go to nodejs.org and you can download that. All right, that took just a minute. I'm going to come over here, and they also suggest if you're using continuous integration, which we are, to install it locally as well. So I'm going to do that, and this will connect it to this individual repo and the site itself. So now I've got it globally on my machine, and I've got it connected to this specific project. With both of those things installed, I need to now come in here and just type Netlify link, and that will actually link this local project to the Netlify site. Now, if this is your first time doing it, you're going to have to log in like it's having me do here. So we'll actually open this up in your web browser, and you just need to authenticate. Now you see over here, it's actually asking me, do you want to use the current Git remote origin? So it's guessing at what it would be, which that would work, or you can actually search by different site names. So I could say like Google or something like this, and it will look through all of my things and find it. However you link it, it should say directory linked, and that's what you want to be looking for. The last thing we're going to do before writing the function is actually install node fetch. So let's come in here and say npm I node fetch like that, and that will install node fetch for us. Sooner than later, node fetch will be included in Node by default, and we won't have to do that. Okay, now that we've got everything connected, we can actually start writing our function. You can spin up a local dev server with Netlify CLI using Netlify dev. And if I type that, it will actually spin up a local server, pull in our variables and everything else, and we're going to be ready to write. You can actually see here, if I come back up this way, that we've got calendar API and the calendar ID showing here. That's what we want. So it's actually pulling in those environmental variables that we added in the GUI, and now we have a chance to interact with those. Let's close down the terminal, and then I'm going to jump over to the docs for building a Netlify function. And I'll just note that I had to kind of restart this section because I ran into a bug in Node 17 and above with Netlify CLI. So in fact, if you come over here to nodejs.org, just check what version you have by doing node -- version. And if you have the 17.4 or anything above 17, it looks like right now they've got a bug. Hopefully by the time you watch this, it'll be fixed. But just in case you run into trouble, it may be worth looking at getting the LTS version instead. Okay, back to what we were doing. We're going to build out a function with Netlify serverless functions. And as you can see here, by default, it puts it in a folder called functions, and that's where Netlify will look for it. And you can just follow this syntax to find that Netlify function. So let's come over here and let's go ahead and open the sidebar. We're going to add a folder here, and we'll call it functions. And then inside here, let's go ahead and create a file. We'll call this calfetch.js. All right, now if I keep coming down this way, you'll notice that the syntax is like this. You have to have an exports.handler, and here's kind of how that looks like. In fact, they give you an example just for like a basic status code down here. So let's go ahead and add that. And then let's open up the terminal again, and let's run Netlify dev. That should spin up our dev server. And if it doesn't open it up like this and give you this little green box, that's when you might want to check in on that Node version. But like I said, hopefully that'll be fixed by the time you see this. Now you'll notice up here that it doesn't actually pull in that function. So it should be actually telling us that it's loading a function. So let's go ahead and do one more thing. Let's come into the sidebar here and add another file. And this file needs to be called netlify.toml. And this is basically a way to tell Netlify where to look to build your functions. So let's pass it a build command here, and we're going to tell it that functions are in a folder called functions. All right, let's save that and come over this way again. Let's try to restart up that dev environment. And you can see now, if I close this sidebar here and come back up this way, it actually is loading that function right here. And it tells us that it's at this port at /netlify functions. And I got to remove all that. There we go. Okay, so there's our message, hello world. So we've got something going on. That's what we want. All right, so let's actually get around to writing this function itself. And let's give ourselves a little bit more space. I'm going to move this over. Let's zoom in just a touch to make it a little easier for you to see. Because all we need is to be able to see that we're getting content over this way. In fact, I'm going to zoom in just a touch on this side too. All right, up top here, the first thing we need to do is actually import fetch itself. So let's import fetch from node fetch. And then let's go ahead and pull in those environmental variables that we stored on Netlify. So that was cal API and cal ID. And both of those we can pull from process.env. And that's actually just part of the environment here that Netlify CLI is creating for us. So we can pull those down pretty quickly. Next, I'm going to pull up the docs over here. And what we're looking at, now that I got us so much space, is this calendar dev docs. And we're looking at the list of events. And as you can see here, here's the syntax. We're going to pass it this URL. This is the fetch that we're doing. And so we need to pass in the calendar ID and the events. And then we need to actually tack on the end of that our API key. And you can see why we're doing this on the back end so that we're not exposing our key to everybody who comes to our site by doing this on the front end. So there's a bunch of different options here like max attendees or max results, how we want to order things. And so we're going to have several of these by default. And then we'll pass just one of these, this max results right here. This will be the thing that the user gets to decide how many they want. And by default, it's 250. And it can never be larger than 2,500. We're only going to let them limit it to like 20 or something like that anyhow. So we'll set it from anywhere from 1 to 20 and let them kind of decide. And by default, I think we'll do something like 9, I think is how I set this project up to start with. So what we're going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and come up top here and grab this right here. And now that you know where to find that, I'm going to close this down so we've just got the minimum we need. The first thing I want to do is actually have a kind of a final URL that we're going to pass to our fetch. So I'm going to say const final URL, and that will be equal to, in backticks here, what we're going to do is basically have a base URL and then tack onto it query parameters, number one, that we want kind of always there, and then also allow the user to pass in their own max results, whatever they would prefer to pass in as far as the number of events they want to pull. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's come up top here though, and we'll say const, let's call this base URL. And we'll start with it like that. And then this calendar ID we need to exchange here for our cal ID like that. And now we actually want to pass in a bunch of default parameters. So I'm going to copy this back up this way. Let's just set this to something like base params. So here we're going to tell it how to order the events. We're also going to tell it kind of what time to pull the events from. So basically this date forward, we don't want past events on this page. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's come over here and we're going to look for order by, and there it is down there. So this is the first thing we're wanting. And you can see start time or updated. All right, it's the last time they're updated. So we're interested in this start time. So let's go ahead and change this out here. And I'll say order by equals start time. All right, the next thing we want to do is look at single events. And you can see that these two things are linked together. And what it says is that we're basically going to return every event, even if it's a recurring event, as a single event. So in other words, we can just kind of read it like a normal event rather than having to basically view the underlying recurring event. Hopefully that makes sense, but basically it'll make it easier to work with the data on our side. And by default, it's set to false, but with this order by start time, we can add to this with an ampersand and then single events, and then we'll say equals true. And then the next one we're looking for is time min. If I come down here, you're going to see the lower bound. All right. So in other words, we want to filter by events that happened at this time or later. All right. So that's what we want to do. So I'm going to grab time min right here. And when the person comes with an ampersand and then time in here, what I want to do is basically figure out what day it is when they are coming and hitting this endpoint. So I'll say equals, and then because we're in backticks here, I can actually just write JavaScript right in here. So I'm going to say new date like that, dot to ISO string. All right, so now we've got that, and it basically will order things by that date. Whenever they've come, that date forward are the only dates it's going to return to us. Now, in order to pass parameters to this URL, all I have to do is come in here and do a question mark, and then pass in the string of parameters. So I'll actually just interpolate that and say base params. And all that setup allows us to come down this way, and first of all, pass in our base URL. That base URL includes those params, and then I need to tack my key onto the end of that. So I'll say key equals, and again here I'm going to add in our API key. Next, just to save some time of you watching me type all this out, I'm going to paste in the rest of this and I'll walk you through it. All right, so basically what we're going to do is have a try catch, and so that way we can catch any errors that come about because of this fetch. And we're going to basically say, first of all, we're going to limit it by the type of request. So we're only allowing GET requests to this endpoint, this Google API. And then what we're going to do is say, as long as that's the case, we're going to pass it the final URL, then get a response from that, and then convert it to JSON here and stringify it, and then post it in the browser with the status code of 200. All right, and then if they do anything else, we're going to basically say, hey, that's not what this endpoint is for, pass a different status code. And then finally, if there's any errors, we're going to catch those. All right, so you can grab that from the repo if you want, or you can type it in. Shouldn't take too long either way. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. And if I come over this way again, let's see, do I have something running? I think I do. Pull this up. Okay, now we're getting an error here that we can't use import inside of anything that's not a module. So probably the easiest way to fix this for now is just to come over this way, and let's just change this to MJS. Close this down, and then I think I need to restart up the dev server. So let's do that. So that starts back up, and then let's go ahead and refresh here. All right, and it's throwing an error at us, so let's figure out what's going on. It's saying that the URL is not valid, so let's come back up this way and just double check that we've got everything set out the right way. You know, off the top of my head, I'm not seeing anything that looks wrong here, so let's go ahead and just keep working. There's a couple other things we need to add, and then we can always come back to this if we need to fix something else. Let's come up here. We're also going to pass in headers object here, so let's say const headers, and here this is just going to be an object, and I'm going to pass in a couple of things. The first thing is just to ensure that we passed a content type application JSON, and then the second thing is we also want to limit kind of which different requests can actually hit this endpoint as well. So we're going to say access control allow methods of just get. Then let's come back down this way, and in addition to passing a body, let's actually pass those headers as well. All right, and I don't think that will fix our problem. No, it won't. All right, so let's come back up, and now we might have to deal with this. And I think I see the problem here. We have get passed in here as well. All right, you probably saw that to start with. Now let's come in here, and you can see we're getting all of our calendar data, which is great. Now, just a couple notes about this. Number one, when we're getting this data back, we're actually passing it in, we're getting an object back, so we're wrapping this in parentheses. So just in case you were manually typing that and you're getting an error, just make sure you've wrapped that in parentheses, and then obviously the then itself is wrapped in parentheses. Next, we can actually come in here and organize this a little bit better by passing null and to, and that will actually give us some tabbing as we get this back by default, so you can actually see it a little bit clearer. There are also lots of different extensions, and you see I've got one here which will actually style it, and I can actually collapse things and all kind of stuff like that. And I've done a video before on this. It's just called JSON Viewer. Just make sure that it only has access when you click on the extension rather than viewing every site you ever go to. All right, so this is what we're going to be getting back here, and I'm going to go ahead and leave this extension up and running. Now, I mentioned there was we want to let the user decide how many things to get back, how many events to get back. And so we can do that by actually passing in some query parameters. So just like we passed in some options to the Google API, we can actually come in here and we can pass in other things up here. So like when we hit this endpoint, we could say like question mark, we could pass in total equals 3 or something like that. Now it looks the exact same, but now the event itself will actually give us those query parameters. Now just so you can see that, I can come in here and console.log, we'll do the event. And the way that the Netlify functions work is you pass in query string parameters. So if I save that and come over here, you're actually seeing down here in the console on the server side, I'm getting total 3. All right, so that's the query parameters I passed in. So I can add on additional things here if I wanted to, like name Chris. And now I'm getting both of those, and I'm getting them returned as an object with those two values, those two keys and values. So what I'm going to be passing in is basically a max results, and I'm going to be getting that from the front end that we'll write next time. So let's go ahead and work with that data. So let's remove that here, and I'm going to actually add it straight to the final URL. So it'll be before the key and after the base URL and all those base params. So I'm going to, again, just add this little template string in here, and this will be that event.query string parameters. And the string I'm going to be passing in will be max results. So just like the Google API has a max results, that's what I'm going to be passing in at the end of my URL, depending on the slider position that the user drags on the front end. And I'm writing a little ternary here, basically saying, hey, is there a query string param called max results? If there is, then what I want you to do is go ahead and add this string on. So and then just like we did with our base params, I'm going to say max results. This is the way that the Google API tells you to do this, and I'm going to pass in here this whole thing. So if those exist, pass them in just like they were given to me. Otherwise, just pass in nothing. So if I come back here and refresh, you can see I'm no longer getting those things console logged because we removed those. But if I were to come in here and now change this up top, and if I change this to max results equals 1, now I should get only one event, and you see that's all I'm getting. By default, remember, it's 250. Or I can come in here and add 20 or something like that, and now you see I've got a bunch of events coming in. So we're going to actually let the user decide by hitting our endpoint what they want to get from us. So in this video, we've gotten everything up on GitHub. We've passed it over to Netlify. We've grabbed our API key from Google, and now we've created this backend function that will run whenever we hit it, and actually lets us pass in our own query string parameters for the max results we want. All right, next time what we're going to do is write the front end code that's going to hit this endpoint, decide how many events we're getting back, and then we'll parse through all this data and display it on our page. If you have questions or run into any problems, let me know, and I'll do what I can to help. But until next time, happy coding.